I will be reading from 1 Peter 3, 13 to 22 from the New Revised Standard Version. Now who will harm you if you are eager to do what is good? But even if you do suffer for doing what is right, you are blessed. Do not fear what they fear, and do not be intimidated. But in your hearts, sanctify Christ as Lord. Always be ready to make your defense to anyone who demands from you an accounting for the hope that is in you. Yet do it with gentleness and reverence. Keep your conscience clear, so that when you are maligned, those who abuse you for your good conduct in Christ may be put to shame. For it is better to suffer for doing good, if suffering should be God's will, than to suffer for doing evil. For Christ also suffered for sins once for all, the righteous for the unrighteous, in order to bring you to God. He was put to death in the flesh, but made alive in the Spirit, in which also he went and made a proclamation to the spirits in prison, who in former times did not obey. And when God waited patiently in the days of Noah, during the building of the ark, in which a few, that is, 8 persons, were saved through water. And baptism, which this prefigured, now saves you, not as a removal of dirt from the body, but as an appeal to God for a good conscience through the resurrection of Jesus Christ, who has gone into heaven and is at the right hand of God, with angels, authorities, and powers made subject to him.
I can still remember those days when we were kids, that it was my sister's turn to pick the video, the VHS tape from Blockbuster, and my brother and I would be frustrated to no end because we just knew that we were going to have to sit through 90 minutes of Strawberry Shortcake or My Little Pony or something else that we just did not want to watch. Do you remember those days when there were knockdown, drag-out fights over who got to control the remote for the TV or pick the radio program that was being listened to? Thankfully, I guess, now everyone's got their own TV, everyone's got their own device. There's a TV in every bedroom and a device in every hand. So everyone has control over what they want to watch. It's a pretty human desire to be in control. Now, I never played it, but one of the most popular computer games of all time was called The Sims. And this was a game that people could, they could turn it on, they could sign in. They started by creating a character. They gave that character whatever job they wanted, whatever family they wanted, whatever house they wanted, and then they played out life as this character, basically choosing whatever this person wanted to do from day to day. Now, one user who used it a lot described it like this. They said, "As a teenager, The Sims was my jam. Back then, I averaged 2 or 3 hours every weekday, and I'd put in a proper session at the weekend. Sometimes I'd play for 6 hours straight. It felt wonderful to return from the incomprehensibly dull monotony of school to a digital world I'd created, a kind of haven of order and control." It seems like a universal human desire to be in control. And so much of our lives revolve around this struggle of taking control whenever and wherever we can. 1 Peter is written to a group of people who are living under the boot of a government and a local community that is suspicious and sometimes even hostile of them. They have little to no control over their own lives. So Peter writes this letter encouraging them to realize and remember their new birth into a living hope. From this perspective, they can experience suffering, but know that their suffering is still not the end. that the powers and the forces that are pushing them down are actually not in control in the end. And since the people don't have control anyway, they have given their lives over to the author of life itself. That's why Peter says that Christians don't have to fear what they, meaning those who are in control, fear. He says that in verse 14, chapter 3, verse 14. Those in control fear losing control. Those in control fear losing their power, losing everything they've built or earned or inherited or taken. They fear losing their lives because they believe that they are the ones in control of them. Now, if we've turned over control to Jesus, we don't have to fear losing control. We don't have to fear losing comfort or privilege. We don't have to fear death. We can, therefore, live in joy and hope. When we are in a position without control, people will take note of our hopeful perspective, and they might even ask us about it. So, Peter says in verse 15, be prepared to explain the hope that is in you. But, he says, do this with gentleness and respect. When we recognize Jesus is in control, we give up trying to control the big picture aspect of our lives, yet we can still choose the responses to our circumstances. We can respond to suffering with fear or with hope. We can respond to non-Christians and opponents with powerful arrogance or with gentle respect. It's the hope, the goodness, and the gentle respect that will most clearly show the world who and whose we are. At some point, which is out of our control, those who malign us for our faith will be ashamed of their actions. Our faith now does not need to be defended or argued. It simply needs to be lived out in gentle, respectful hope. Now, to see what this looks like, I'd like to offer two examples. The first comes from the book of Daniel. In the book of Daniel, the Israelites are living in exile in the enemy territory of Babylon after Jerusalem and the temple have been destroyed. Now remember, this is the time when the prophet Jeremiah wrote to the people and encouraged them to hold on to hope, because at some point God would return them back. This is Jeremiah 29:11. I know the plans I have for you. They're encouraged to hold on to hope because God would bring them back to their land. But until that time, Jeremiah says, live normal lives. Plant gardens, build walls and homes, get married. Live normal lives in this land of exile, in the foreign territory. Now, after they had been there for a while, King Nebuchadnezzar built a gigantic golden statue of himself. And he ordered everyone in the land to bow down to that statue when the music played to honor the king. Now, there were 3 Israelite men who had attained pretty high positions in the Babylonian government: Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. When the music played and it was time to bow down to the golden statue of Nebuchadnezzar, they did not. When the king found out about this, he was furious that they didn't worship his statue. He threatened them and said, I will throw you into a burning furnace if you don't bow down. And this is how the men replied. This is what they said to the king. King, we don't need to defend our faith to you. If you throw us into the furnace, the God we serve is able to rescue us, and will do it. But even if he doesn't, you need to understand that we will not worship your gods or bow down to your statue. The king, furious, had them thrown into the blazing furnace. But when he looked in, instead of seeing 3, he saw 4 men, and none of them were on fire. So the king called to the men, and the original 3 walked out. And everyone could see that they were not burned. Their bodies were not burned. Their clothes were not burned. So the king praised these men of faith and praised their God. He was amazed at their willingness to suffer instead of worship other gods. Now, the tragic but kind of comical end of this story is that Nebuchadnezzar, who all along has been maintaining his control as much as possible and fighting for control and defending his honor or his power, still can't quite let go, even after seeing and naming the power of their God. So even after witnessing this nonviolent, non-defensive protest and the power of their God, who he says is the powerful one, the one who can save, the one in control, he still grabs for whatever little power he can, because he says, well, if anyone disrespects this God, I will cut them to little bits. You can almost see Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego slapping their foreheads in disbelief, because this guy just does not get it. The second person that I wanted to talk about is Helena von Freiberg. Helena was an extremely wealthy woman who lived in Austria in the 1500s. She was wealthy, like castle wealthy. She lived in a castle. After she and her sons were rebaptized as adults, which was illegal according to the Holy Roman Empire, she started hosting a church, a congregation of Anabaptists in her castle. Soon the authorities found out and sent an armed guard to arrest her. So she fled to Switzerland, settled in a new city, and began hosting a house church there. Now, when the city officials of that city found out what she was doing, they banished her from there. So she returned to her homeland. And after the local leaders found out she was back and yet again hosting church, they demanded that she recant publicly of her faith. Helena agreed to recant, but only privately to one government official. Afterwards, she left her hometown, and moved to Augsburg, where she started another house church and hosted an Anabaptist congregation. Now, there was some toleration for Anabaptists there, yet she was arrested, she was interrogated, she was chained overnight in prison, and eventually she was released, but told she was going to have to leave the city. Her sons stepped in at this point who had some influence, and they were able to convince the city officials to allow her to stay. She remained in Augsburg for the rest of her life, hosting and leading a church in her home. Helena was an amazing example of someone who continued to live out her faith in simple, gentle ways, even in the midst of opposition and suffering and struggle. Now, these days, it seems like we've gotten to the point of experiencing pandemic exhaustion. And in these times, I think the temptation for us is to grab control wherever we can, to take some control back over our lives. We want things back the way they were. We want to choose when and where we travel, when and where we meet, on and on and on. There's so many ways in which our human nature wants us to wrestle control back from the forces that have taken it. Now, unfortunately, this may drive us hard to want to rush back into normal life, even if it means that we're taking extra health risks. But I think Peter would want us to remember that the truth is that because Jesus is in control of all these forces, we don't need to defend our faith or even our conceptions of what normal life is. Instead, I think Peter would say that we are encouraged to live with so much hope and gentleness and respect that we will stand out from the masses who are grabbing and clawing for control. And when that happens, when we live in that way and we are asked about it, we then have the opportunity to share the good news that Jesus is in control. Jesus is Lord of all.